My name's Laurie Tasharski. I am the Director of Institutional Abuse Prevention at SCAN of Northern Virginia. SCAN stands for Stop Child Abuse Now. My role there is to work with youth-serving organizations, of which this is one. Because I come from a background, I'm a survivor. I have worked in schools, I'm trained as an educator, and we know that wherever children are, harm can happen. So I just want to thank you so much for being here, for caring about children in your organization and in your community. So our topic is creating sanctuary, supporting children's safety wherever they are in the community. We are a rights-based child protection organization. So what a lot of people don't understand is that child welfare looks at the law. Rights-based child protection is beyond the law. Our true north are children's rights. And so we're looking, the law is sort of changing all the time, comes and it goes, moves forward and it moves back. And so our true north is children's rights. We are going to ask you at the very end to grab this QR code and evaluate this training. That's an obligation of our grant funding that enables me to be in front of you at no cost to your organization and enables me to be in front of lots of other organizations at no cost to them. So thank you so much. If you have a phone, you can grab that QR code now just by aiming your phone at it with your photo, with your camera turned on. And I know Susan will also share with you and others who will watch the recording, those who are online. I have a colleague who might put the connection to this evaluation in the chat. So if you're used to grabbing something from the chat, you can grab it from there. You'll have another opportunity at the end. I'll show that QR code to you again at the end. So one of the things I always say when I talk to people about child protection, we have among us survivors and supporters of survivors. This topic is hard. If we're parents and grandparents and community members, sometimes when we talk about children, we're thinking about a specific child, and that makes us have strong emotions. That's perfectly normal. Please take care of yourselves, take care of others. If someone feels strong emotions, you can step back. I like to write something or have a drink, or movement sometimes helps me if I'm feeling strong emotions. And what I like to guide is to check in and see if that person's okay, but maybe don't ask why. They're feeling strong emotions. It may not be something they're ready to talk about. We're not going to speak about abuse in any explicit way, it's just so you know. And usually I start these conversations with this idea of what brings us together. What do we value? We're in a faith community. You already know that you share a lot of common values around faith, around honesty, the kinds of things we treat our children. These are sort of big ideas. And that's where I'm going when we talk about what makes a child safe. Take a moment to just think about that. What makes a child safe? Any ideas, anything you want to share out with me? I'm going to ask you. You can participate in any way you want, please, and stop me at any time for questions. Yeah?
Well, just the more people that are watching the problems, the better it is.
Beautiful answer. Thank you. Adults taking their safety responsible, as their responsibility. Any other ideas about what makes a child safe? Perhaps suitable environments, developmentally appropriate material, love, affirmation. All of these things help a child be safe, as well as opportunities to test their skills and to learn new things. Those also improve a child's safety. And when we think about also, using this image, the kinds of things that there's a little delay on this, the kinds of things that we think about how we can help a child be safe, because that feels a little bit like, whoa, that's big, that's a big ask, that's a big lift. But if we think about even just this picture, someone helping a child learn to ride a bike, right? So we grab on to the back of the seat. If we keep grabbing onto that seat, actually that child might be less safe if they learn how to ride the bike. But maybe we put training wheels on. Maybe we have a helmet, and we work on the skills slowly, a little more each day. All of those things are things that we can do to help children be safe. And I'm going to give you a little bit of heavy stuff in the beginning, but most of this talk is about things that you can do to help children in your family, your neighborhood children, children in this community and in this church. So there are things you can do to help. Rights-based child protection comes directly to us from the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the single most successful treaty in human history. Every single country has signed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So if someone tells you, well, abuse is different in that culture or that society than our society, you call them on that, because that's not true. We have every single country, and the US has not ratified this yet, the only country not to do so, but we were instrumental in the drafting of it. So every single country agrees what children's rights are, and basically, they're anything that promotes healthy development for a child and keeps them safe from harm. So all of these things are sort of the kinds of things we're going to be thinking about and talking about. They prioritize the best interest of the child. We hear a lot today about parental rights. Of course, the needs of the family are very important to the needs of the child. And in most cases, what's best for the family is what's best for the child. We're also called on to be a little discerning about cultural traditions that have worked for generations, that we're all a part of, because children are part of a culture, they're part of religion, they're part of a society, but we're called upon to reflect on those cultural traditions. So we think about them, and we think about what's new about what we know about human development and child development, and are these cultural traditions still appropriate? And in many cases, they are still appropriate and important for children. We also, of course, think about this applying to all children. This is not just for boys. This is not just for wealthy people. This is not just for children who are able-bodied. So we think about these rights as applying to all children, regardless of their gender expression, their gender identity, their sexuality, their ability or disability, whether they're neurodivergent. All of these rights apply to all our children. Are there any questions about children's rights? Great. The nice thing is this gives us a place to talk where we all can kind of be on the same page. And I may be moving this around too much. Let's see. So the last part of that is, I don't know if you caught it, I just need to be a little more patient. All adults are responsible for keeping children safe, as was said. Thank you so much for saying that. So let's just take a moment and talk about why we as adults need to protect children's rights. Any idea about why children's rights might need extra protection? Yeah. Beautiful, thank you. Easy to overlook, travel-sized for our convenience, right? We can just pick them up and take them anywhere they want to go with them. Any other ideas about why children's rights are important? Yes?
Ask them to hold their hand and not leave them alone before they talk.
Oh, okay. Or I can repeat the answer as well. Okay. Yeah, okay. Any other thoughts? We're going to give you opportunities to grab a mic. Yes, over here.
Of protecting themselves.
Right, so they're developing. They don't have the language. They may still be learning skills. They may need to make a few mistakes before they can make better choices. And the way to learn those skills is by making sort of low stakes mistakes, right? Having choice and voice and agency. Thank you so much. And what might be the benefits? We've got some youth educators here in the room. What are the benefits to knowing what children prefer? What children, helping children make their own decision? Are there benefits to our programs from that? If we think about that? I made a list of some of, yes? I'm going to repeat you, so you don't need a mic.
We're helping them to become good citizens so that they can be good adults.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much for that. We can increase their sense of competency, right? We can, as you've said, help them be better adults. We learn what they need and want. Are children not experts on themselves? right? We can't know those things unless we ask those questions. So those are some of the answers that we give. Could you let me know if you've heard of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs? Put your hand up if you've heard of ACEs. Oh, awesome. About half of you have heard of the ACE study. Anyone want to take a stab at describing what the ACE study is for us? Susan, you have a mic.
Was it on before? Is it on now?
There we go.
I've been holding it live this whole time. So the adverse childhood experiences was research they did that found that adults who had experienced these negative things when they were children, they had an increased risk for a number of sort of bad outcomes, more than you would expect in a general population, or looking at other things about them. So they're listed here, but including mental health, substance abuse, but also surprisingly like health outcomes, like they're more likely to have heart attacks or die early or be obese, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is 20-year-old research we've been building on. The original ACEs were chosen by a cardiac surgeon who wanted things that were preventable. So he didn't consider, families that moved a lot. He didn't consider historical trauma or racism. So there's a lot more than these 10. If you ever wondered what your ACE score is, you can just look at those and count on your fingers. The good news about adverse childhood experiences is that the more harm you've experienced, the more help helps you. Also, I want to point out that this correlation between many bad lifelong outcomes, both behaviorally and physically in terms of your health, are preventable from positive experiences and connections. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit later. I put this here so that we can just think about harm for a minute, just 2 slides thinking about harm. It's a little broader than what you might be thinking of. We don't want to wait until a crime has been committed. So we think about child protection concerns as something that's giving us a feeling of something not being right. You're all reasonable adults. We call that the reasonable adult measure. Right? Something's not quite right. What am I seeing? What am I hearing? It just doesn't feel right to me. And that includes, of course, attempting to harm a child, putting a child at risk of harm. And I'm sorry to tell you that sometimes our behavior, including mine for many years, before we know what we know, I have done things that have put children at greater risk of harm. I have made them more vulnerable by crossing boundaries. So as a teacher, I might not have known what I was seeing, I may not have acted on it, but I maybe also formed deep relationships with children that cross boundaries. Even though I didn't harm them, it may have made them more vulnerable to harm from someone else. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. I do recommend always, especially for those of us who are teachers in the room, let's not look back, let's look forward, what we know now, because we can't know what we didn't know before. Also, I want to mention vulnerability, and you've heard this word a lot before. You may know that children with disabilities are far more vulnerable to harm. Children who are LGBTQ+ are more vulnerable to harm. These things are not the fault of the child. These things are because the systems they're in are creating vulnerability. So let's be sure we understand what vulnerability means before we say, well, if my child's LGBTQ, they're in more danger in the world. That's not because they chose to be LGBTQ and are putting themselves in danger. So what does this include? And I'm going the wrong direction. There it is. So you're familiar with physical, emotional, sexual abuse, and neglect. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that this is probably broader than what you think. So with physical abuse, this would include sustained physical activity or sustained physical restraint. So if you're thinking about an organization, maybe there's a coach at the school who makes the kids run in 100-degree weather, running and running and running. That could, not stopping. That could be sustained physical activity, which could be abusive and harmful to children, right? And if we drop down to neglect, not letting them drink water on that 100-degree day might be a form of neglect. So sexual abuse, we generally say, anything beyond a child's understanding. So that definitely goes beyond what we typically think of as contact sexual abuse. Sexual abuse can include contact and very often does not include contact. So online abuse, obviously no contact, just as harmful, if not more harmful, than contact sexual abuse. Voyeurism, there's many forms, sexual harassment, exposing a child to adult material, all of these things can be abusive. I promise we're getting to the happier news in a minute. Emotional abuse, the most common form of abuse because it's part of all other forms of abuse in many cases. And neglect, the most reported form of abuse. Any of you who have teaching experience in your background know within a couple of weeks with a group of kids, you can spot that neglected kid really fast. So it tends to be more reported. It also comes disguised often as economic disadvantage. As the ACE study has taught us, these are some of the impacts. There's the immediate impact, the immediate harm of hitting a child with a belt, for example, the immediate loss of trust, loss of connection, loss of belonging. And then there are short and long-term impacts. Even children as young as 3 or 4 months old will exhibit short-term and observable impacts from abuse. Excessive crying, inability to be settled. When we talk about signs and indicators of abuse, I do want to point out they may or may not be present, and they may or may not indicate abuse has happened. So we have to, use this as a qualifier. But this is some of the long-term impacts of abuse. And again, some of them are behavioral. So if I'm constantly being triggered because I'm a witness to violence in the home, maybe I'm trying to self-soothe by vaping, which turns into smoking, which turns into drug use, right? So behavioral impacts. But we know now, and this is evolving science, what we know now is just this moment in time. So it's amazing to learn about how the brain reacts to harm when we're children. Actually, the brain chemistry has changed. Our brain is flooded with neurotransmitters and cortisol, and that changes our ability to think properly, to make connections, our executive order functioning, our ability to plan and organize, all of those things are impacted by harm. I also want to point out that harm could be one episode, it could be many. So we tend to throw around this word trauma a lot. So one of the things I just want to say is that you and I might be in a room together and you may be feeling like this danger that's outside the room is lessening and the doors are locked and you're safe, and I may be feeling exactly the opposite. We may be in the same situation and have a very different trauma response. Not to mention our background, our personality, lots of other factors are involved there. Any questions about impacts? Great. Last thing we're going to do that's kind of heavy is we're going to just unpack a few myths. And this time, I think most of the people in this audience know what the myths are, but I want you to think a little bit about what's the impact of the myth. Because we understand that even if we don't believe something to be a myth, other people do. And we're socializing children to think that these things are commonly thought. So let's just unpack 5. I have clicked, I'm waiting. This is teaching me patience, Craig. I need it. It's making me very zen. So abuse is inevitable. Who's heard a teacher say, well, kids will bully, right? It's just going to happen. So what's the impact of believing abuse is inevitable? Shrug, right? Well, it'll continue. Or that it's really not that serious. Kids, it all comes out in the wash. Kids are okay. It doesn't matter. It didn't matter to me when I was hit, So what's the impact of believing that? Normalizing. We also put our own bias on things, right? So if I wasn't impacted by corporal punishment, for example, no one else is. And that's a big bias for survivors. I just want to point out to those of you who are survivors, sometimes we need to take a step back and say, oh, there's lots of it. We have a lot in common with other survivors, but we don't have everything in common with other survivors. So sometimes we need to take extra care to make sure we check our bias at the door. Thank you for that. This one, kids make stuff up. Kids lie. Yeah, so what's the impact of kids lie? Yeah, so nothing they say can be true. I'm going to minimize whatever they say or believe or feel. Yes?
Kids can lie. It's not like they don't, but that doesn't mean that everything they say has to be a lie. And when you say that, oh, they cheated at a board game, maybe they didn't. You don't know if they did or didn't. And when you say that they're lying, it makes them, I think, more self-conscious about saying how they feel, because you might say, oh, you're lying, you don't actually like this, and you have to like this.
Thank you. She said self-conscious. She said feeling like everything they say won't be believed. And I'm going to pick out on that self-conscious piece, because what it is it's silencing them. Because if you think people won't believe you, especially this crazy thing, this person everyone adores did something bad to you, your parents love them, you're absolutely not going to take the risk and tell anyone this thing has happened. So thank you so much for that point. Also, to your point, kids lie about things that make them look better, like I won the game. Right? Not things that everyone has made clear are dirty, shameful, illicit, not spoken about. Kids talk about being heroes. They don't generally cast themselves as the villain. I've pushed it. Trying again. Well, it's okay if we get a couple. I'm not sure where I'm aiming this thing, to be honest. Back towards you. Okay, thank you. Of course, I don't know why I'm aiming at the screen. So people who abuse our monsters. Let's, for one moment, think about what the impact of that is. What's the impact of that? Yes?
It makes us not aware that anybody who looks like anybody could be.
Yes, thank you. She said it makes us unaware that it could be anyone. It could be a woman. It could be another child. Sometimes when I'm working with educators, I say, put your hand up if you have a pedophile in your school. No one raises their hand, right? So let's understand that we're closer to parity than not in gender. Let me repeat that. We have almost as many female offenders as male. They are invisible to us because they offend very differently. They tend to offend only one person at a time. They're relational offenders, so they might get on a slippery slope. They might like the attention. It may turn sexual. They have one victim, and then they move on to the next. Okay? It's feeding their needs. Very different. Men tend to have more victims. However, it's the opposite for children. Under the age of puberty, girls who act out sexually, problematic sexual behaviors, tend to harm more girls than boys who, over puberty, harm in dating violence, a terrible word, but, or act out sexually, tend to have only one or two at a time victims. So they're very complicated. The research is there. Unfortunately, we can't say, this is what it looks like. It always looks like this. It doesn't. It's not that easy. Okay, so we'll move on from that. I've already talked about this. I think one of the impacts of this, what's the impact of us telling boys that they're not victims? What we have right now, which is that men are silenced or only seen as perpetrators. And that now any perpetration, and we see this in the national rhetoric, is, why didn't you, or how come, or it's your fault. So terrible victim blaming for men. So of course they aren't going to speak up. Oh, I'm aiming back here. And the last one is, sorry, I think I'm going back. Okay, the last one was my child will tell me. Thank you, thanks so much. So what's the impact of believing that? Yes, thank you.
Most often kids, or I guess in a sense teens as well, will not tell anyone what happened because they're afraid of what could happen especially if they tell the wrong person. Because if they tell the wrong person, they may, again, not believe them. Mm-hmm. And it may end up where they just continue to get abused as if nothing happened.
Thank you. And the worst part is it silences everyone around them, because they may tell their friend and say, yes, I already talked to the school counselor, she did nothing. And so every other person is now silenced. So that is contagious. Yes?
I was just going to say, the use is your own vigilance.
Yeah.
if you assume your child's going to tell you.
Absolutely. So reducing your own vigilance, and you know, thinking, well, if something goes wrong, they'll say so, right? Never mind that they're showing strong emotions about being online at a specific time. They're closing their door, or they're showing aversion to a digital device, or they're spiraling into self-harm, or show other signs and indicators. Thank you so much for that. All right. So really quickly, we're going to talk about how often abuse happens. We're talking about sexual abuse, 1 in 5 girls, 1 in 7 boys. In some countries, it's 1 in 2. These numbers vary depending on age, where you are in the world, the communities that you live in. I've already talked a little bit about how this varies by gender and age. I think one of the most important things is that 1/3 to 1/2 of all sexual harm up to the age of 18 is committed by other children, usually because there's some power differential there. So an older child, a child with more power because of their gender or because of their background, that's where this can happen. The good news is if we intervene suitably and appropriately, these children do not go on to offend in adulthood. And I should also say that some of these stereotypes about who harms people who experience childhood sexual abuse are no more likely to harm in adulthood than the general population, and LGBTQ plus people are no more likely to harm sexually than the general population. This stat isn't really applicable to physical abuse. We do know that people who are physically abused are more likely to use physical punishment. It can change, but in terms of sexual abuse, many, many people who are survivors go on to keep people safe. So please know that. This is a school stat. I'm not going to put a church stat up just because it varies so dramatically. But this was a study done very recently and repeated over a decade. This is phone calls to adults asking if they experienced any of these forms of abuse in a school, and 1 in 10 experienced what was defined for them of sexual harassment or sexual abuse by an employee of the school. So for those of you who are teachers, think of every cohort you've had, you know, of 30 kids or 28 kids, 1 in 10. So we definitely were teaching kids who were being harmed. We just didn't know. Okay, so here's what we can do, and I think this is the most important. I hope someone's watching me on time. I want to give the lion's share of the time to this. These are the 5 things we're going to talk about a little more deeply. And I wonder, I'm going to read this to you because I realize it might be kind of small for some of you. My husband just found this in the Washington Post a few days ago, and I put it in because it really describes perfectly what a lot of people feel. This is an Ask Amy, and the question was, is there any justification or logical reasoning behind some of these new parenting trends? One that is particularly irksome is letting a toddler choose whether they want a hug by an immediate family member. On 2 recent occasions, I, a very close uncle, was denied a hug. This was the choice of the 3-year-old. This choice was reinforced by that parent. I'm sorry, I'm putting a little extra emotion, but you feel it. You feel it a little bit? This choice was reinforced by the parent. What's your reaction to this? Any thoughts? Yeah, please.
I think that it's good that kids get to decide if they want to hug someone, because a kid may not feel, especially even if it is an immediate family member, they may not feel safe hugging them, or they may just want a day where they don't get a hug and they just want to be alone no matter what.
Love that. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that I also feel that way, that you should ask someone if they want to be hugged or not. And the reason is that kids are much more capable of making decisions than we used to think. And, you know, when HIV came in, I found out that I could teach 2- and 3-year-olds to put on a Band-Aid by themselves. You know, all kinds of things that I didn't think were possible. Yeah. I'd been teaching preschool for, 10 years before HIV came, and I always hugged kids, and I always held them, and I always took care of boo-boos and all that stuff. And I learned how to do it to have them do it themselves. Yeah. So they're much more capable than we think.
And you still have warm, authentic relationships with them. Yes. We used to say I get paid in hugs. And then I was like, I don't know if we should be saying that. But, you know, any other things popping out about this letter? Please, Laurie.
As a parent of a child who's autistic, that physical touching isn't comfortable for a lot of kids.
Thank you so much. So some children are neurodivergent. What I'm also seeing here is, let's go on. Let's read a little further into this. I can't ever recall a time I didn't want to hug or kiss a close family member growing up. For the 5 to 10 seconds a hug lasts, all the problems in the world seem to go away. How will this type of upbringing affect young children as they get older? What do you think? Yes.
I think that in this case, this adult who likes being hugged, they like being hugged, that's a personal choice. But I think that if kids and adults as well get to decide if they want to be hugged, I think that'll help a lot because everyone will, like younger kids will be able to start teaching them that that is consent and that you don't have to hug someone or you don't have to give someone a kiss if you don't want to.
Yeah, so this is a person in power who's getting to decide, right, what's right for the person not in power. And if we unpack that a little further and we think about, to your point, he's wanting this for himself, not for the needs of the child, for his needs, you know, to make the problems of the world go away. I'm also thinking 10 seconds for a hug. 1, 2, 3. That's a wiggly 3-year-old. That's long, right? How will this type of upbringing affect young children as they get older? Well, if we think about that for a minute, how will it affect a child that their no makes an adult angry and distances them from that adult? So ruins attachment and belonging. So saying no then becomes something you never want to do whether you feel it or not. You have to say yes. I'm looking at a lot of ladies who've been socialized to say yes to everything because that is what is ladylike or polite. So our room to say no shrinks when we don't ask consent, when we don't allow children to have autonomy over their bodies. Are there ways to establish a caring moment for this uncle who really wants to connect with this 3-year-old? What are some of them? I'll repeat you, so just shout them out to me.
Get on the floor and play with them.
Love, get on the floor and play, get down to their level. Fist bump, and you can even do, you don't have to, if it feels awkward, just be like, hug, fist bump, high five. You can kind of use your body language there. You don't have to ask it. Plus, the more we ask it, the more it doesn't feel weird, right? Like, are you a toucher? Are you a hugger? I mean, we all do this as adults now. Okay, love. Okay, thank you so much. I know you can come up with lots of other ways to have relationships as well. So teaching children their rights is our first step. What's the great news about teaching children bodily autonomy? The benefits, I think we've said some of them. One is they understand there are boundaries. We've just taught them there are boundaries. We've just taught them that it's okay to say no to an adult. We've just taught them to listen to their gut. I'm saying no because I'm 3 years old and I'm like really busy and I want to look at this plant and learn about that plant. But I may be saying no because this person just is not my person. And aversion of a person or a place is one of the signs and indicators of abuse. And I can tell you, I had a strong aversion to my abuser, and no one picked up on it. I did not want to sit next to him at Thanksgiving. I did not want to sit next to him at church. I did not want to be near him. So that's a message that can be missed. Yes?
I just wanted to say that it still falls on adults to tell children in your own family who might be appropriate and inappropriate, because I had a very difficult, hyperactive kid as my own kid who, when his grandmother came to him, he said, "You're not my mother." And I said, "But grandmothers, it's okay to hug them," and so he learned to do that.
Yeah, but you know, there's polite and there's not polite. I am never going to be against teaching manners. And certainly we want to understand, children need to understand that doctors are needing to touch them for their own health and healthy development. But there's a way, as to your point, there are many more times we can say, here's a washcloth, right? Wash yourself. Did you do a good job? You know, and start letting children have a little more freedom to own those skills for taking care of themselves. So, I finally got it. How do we encourage body autonomy? We've just listed a bunch: the fist bump, the you know, fist bump, hug, high five. We can encourage body autonomy by pointing out to children what consent looks like, right? Your friend is like not wanting to play with you, right? He's not saying he doesn't want to play with you, but he's not over here. Is there maybe something that's going on that he doesn't like? What does no look like? Does no look like backing away? Does no look like no affirmation? Does no look like cringing? Right? These are all things we can teach our child about autonomy, because kids themselves are going to be touchy, touchy, touchy and all over each other. Sometimes they play like siblings, even when they're not siblings, rolling all over each other. Teaching them to identify other people's boundaries is really important, especially there were preschool teachers. We've been touched a lot by kids in inappropriate places, and sort of setting those boundaries for kids between teacher and mom, or mom teaching, you know, not when we're in the supermarket. You know, we're gonna start to teach boundaries. And it's important to teach boundaries because they're hard. It's hard for adults as well. One of the reasons we call consent a do no harm orientation, because those of us in the room, like me, you'll remember no means no, and you'll remember yes means yes. And then what we realized is that when we were telling girls yes means yes, they were sharing sexual images online, and the boys could ask and ask and ask and ask. I've worked cases where a girl was asked every single day for a year for a sexual image, and she eventually sent it thinking that asking would stop. Is that consent? Right? So we need to teach our boys not to do harm. We need to not do harm. So some of these we've already talked about. Really important is if something happens to their body that they don't like, it's not their fault. So it's really important not to shift blame, and avoid normalizing social media practices that take consent away from children. I have a short video on this at the end, but when we post pictures of children we think are cute or embarrassing and we laugh at them, we are teaching them that it's okay to take pictures of their friends and post them online because they're funny or mocking or silly. So we have to take very seriously our children's privacy when we post about them online. And yes, even in the family, because there's lots of other ways to share information that kids are willing to have shared. So we want to foster help-seeking skills. Talked about this a little bit. Giving children the language to describe how they're feeling. So glad, mad, sad, or angry. Giving them those words and helping them play off of them, including some of the words for their body parts. Because if you think about it, there's a thing we can't say. We know that's shameful. Right? If I won't use the words from my body or your body, how are you going to talk about it if someone touches you there? How are you already know that this is kind of illicit. So that's why we say use the proper terms for body parts instead of, and if you're not going to, at least understand that you need to separate shame from all parts of our body. All parts of our bodies have functions. Yes? Yes, thank you.
Sometimes they don't know what's going on and getting them to start talking about it.
Thank you. So she said one of the words that we need to provide for them is confused. And we also need to model being confused, right? So we need to say, well, I'm finding that reaction from that other driver at the gas station. I'm really confused. I'm not sure if he was mad at me or he was asking me to move the car. You know, like what are my choices here? I could just like smile and say thank you, or I could go ask him what he's trying to convey to me. So just modeling what problem solving looks like when we have an emotion that we're experiencing. The last one here is knowing the difference between a secret and a surprise. Have you ever heard this before? Put your hand up if you've heard this secret and a surprise. Yeah, of course you have. I'm really happy the young people know it as well. So a surprise tends to be something that people are going to be happy about, and a surprise is something that happens at a specific time. A secret is something that has no expiration date. It's something that we keep hidden for a long, long time, and we don't share it because people would be uncomfortable or angry or disgusted or sad. So that's the difference between a surprise and a secret. So when you talk to kids and you say, I don't want you to keep secrets from me, surprises full on, no problem. Yes?
And sometimes I feel like I have friends who have given secrets to other people or me, and sometimes secrets can separate you from your friends or can build up inside of you until you feel so bad that you just have to say it to someone.
Yeah, and then it's your fault, right?
Then it's my fault that I said something.
You're the one who betrayed. So they thank you for that great nuance and that point about them destroying trust. So maintaining healthy boundaries, just give me a boundary you can think of. What kinds of boundaries are there? There's boundaries of time, place, gender, age, right? Situation, language, right? So if I brought someone up here and we were going to do an exercise and they maybe looked a little bit like me, then our boundaries would be lower, right? We might be able to stand nearer to each other. We might be less uncomfortable touching each other, right? We have more in common. But if it wasn't a church, it was a bar, and it wasn't daytime, it was nighttime, those boundaries might change, right? Depending on where we are, who the person is, change the gender of the person, the boundary changes. Right? So boundaries are super hard for adults, crazy hard for kids, right? When we think about boundaries, and I'm going to read this next one to you, I just want you to put your hand up if you're unsettled by what I'm going to read to you, for any reason. So Volunteer Jay is well liked by parents for providing special activities outside of the program. I'm seeing one hand, okay? Jay has favorites. This is a progression, by the way. So the first one still exists. Now there's this. Jay has favorites, and many are eager to be selected for the programs and trips he leads. So a few more, including the first one, all right? Jay chooses a child from the program who lives nearby to walk his dog. I've got all the same hands up, and one or two new ones, so bravo to you. Jay now has access to this child alone. This child has access to Jay's house. It's now normal for Jay to be seen with this child and for this child to be at Jay's house. Jay is touchy, sometimes rubbing backs or feet. This persists despite being asked to talk. Oh, I'm actually seeing faces and I'm seeing cringing. Yes, yes. And on Jay's trips, everyone stays in one big room in sleeping bags. This feels a little bit like a red herring to some people. Like, well, there's lots of people there. The rule of three, right? We've got more than one person in a room. But this is very often offending in plain sight. In this case, this is a real case. Jay is male. But I want you to test yourself for a minute and read through those. Think about what I just said. If Jay was Jen and not Jeff, would you have been uncomfortable sooner, less, early? And I'm guessing less early for most of you, if at all, never unsettled, if Jen is female. So just unpack that bias for yourself for a minute, and let's move on to explaining this. I did ask there, what barriers would exist to sharing those concerns. If anyone wants to describe for me, if Jay was in your program, would you have known who to talk to about any of those things? How would you have found the words? What would you have said? Would you have looked like a person with a dirty mind? That's a big one.
Sure.
Well, Susan?
I think if you go back for a second, I don't know. I'm sorry to make you do something
No.
quicker.
I'm getting good at it now.
But I think the thing is like there's not. Might feel like in the beginning there's not really like a boundary or a policy that person is breaking. I mean, until you get to like the rubbing and not stopping when people ask them to stop. But it's challenging.
Yeah. So rule breaking tends to be a place where we sort of, but you have to have the rule first, right?
Right. Yeah.
There's
So
only rule breaking if there's a rule. Persistent and resist correction is something you and I might agree is worrisome, but if there's no rule, that can make it hard. I'm going to come to you in the back. I would also say having favorites, is that really something we want? And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about someone currying adult favor in a second. That person who talks to the adult and ignores the kid, but they're still the teacher. That's a little off for me. Yes, in the back.
I feel like you were saying that favorites are always something that brings up some kind of, I guess, an issue, which means that they, I guess, in a sense, could feel more connected to the child. And favorites are one of those things I always look out for, because you never know why that a teacher or adult or friend has a favorite.
Can we just put the young people in charge now? Let's just go right to it. So unprofessional. But also, what about the kids who aren't favorites, right? That's not okay. So there's a power play going on anytime you have favorites, right? Threats, pretty obvious. Bribes, pretty obvious. Favorites. None of us want a teacher who plays favorites. Okay, so let's go on to the next. And this is the only slide I still have from, yes?
And frankly, for me, the first one is the biggest trigger.
Okay, really?
Once the program is done, you come get your kid, or the kid has a thing arranged, but the person who does things outside of the program, whether it's giving a kid a ride home or going and playing soccer afterward, that's the red flag.
Yeah. Thank you, Craig.
And it's one of those things that's ingrained. When a program here ends, it's done.
It's called out-of-program contact. It's a major negative indicator. I love that Craig came all the way around the desk to tell us we're missing something here, because it's true. It's never one thing. It is a pattern of negative indicators. We call them red flags, right? And I don't like calling them red flags because it's like, if you see just one, you should know. I think it's more like the buildup, right? Normally, I wouldn't talk about the technical word description of, I'll come right to you, the description of grooming, but grooming is being misused right now all over the place, so I want to address it. Yes?
And sometimes people, if they like someone, like either romantically or as a friend, they will or do ignore the red flags, because someone might say, oh, this person's talking about you behind your back. And you might be like, oh, that's okay because they're my friend. But it isn't, because they're just ignoring the red flags to keep this relationship that is potentially quite toxic.
Thank you for that. And I will say to you, when we see children recant or lie about a disclosure in the beginning, very often it's because the offender is another girl or an adult that they are compliant to. So they didn't consent to, you can't consent to be abused. But very often the lie that's there is because they still like the boy. And, this boy sexually assaulted them, and they still like him, teenagers. But, this is human. So we need to unpick these things. By the way, I do want to say, in terms of false allegations, tiny. I've met educators who tell me that in 40 years, they only ever had false allegations. And then I tell them that it's less than 5% and usually 2% for children disclosing abuse. And then they get to look back on 40 years of denying a child justice and the truth, right? Even for adults, 8% for adult women, says the FBI. So you understand that false allegations, extremely rare. Recanting, on the other hand, saying you lied, very common, because of the attention and the burden and the blame that we put on survivors. So grooming, it's manipulative, it's controlling, and it's not just aimed at the victim, it's aimed at all of us in the community and the parents as well. So what is the purpose of real grooming? It's not just saying gay. Real grooming has an intent to gain access to a child, whether that's because you have a sexual preference for children or they just make you feel good, right? So sometimes with female offending, what you see is a slippery slope. You know, they're involved in a divorce, or they're feeling bad, or they're struggling at work, and this child loves them and idolizes them and thinks they're wonderful and smart and clever and witty, and they spend more time with that child because it makes them feel good, and then it just starts going the direction it shouldn't go. You already have an inauthentic relationship, but it still ends up in the same place. So initiating, maintaining abuse, and phase 3, concealing abuse and preventing detection. Back to Craig, that volunteer who all the parents love, everybody knows it. You can conceal abuse and prevent detection really easily if you're that guy or woman. Please.
Sorry, and like with that, that child may be, oh, they love me, so it's okay. But in the end, when they find out that that person did not actually really love them, it will mess with their brain and their body and how they feel.
Yeah, and it can take many years. We know the body keeps the score. I'm going to skip past that. We know that children, even before they have memories of harm, know that their bodies know that harm has happened to them, and it impacts their healthy development. So what do we need to do? We need to pay attention. We need to be curious. We are crazy not curious enough when kids give us signs and indicators of harm. What are some of those signs and indicators of harm? I'll repeat you, so just say them if they come to your mind. How might we know or not know?
You're saying aversion?
Aversion to people and places. Aversion to a computer if they previously played a computer. Changes in behavior, you know. Somatic complaints, right? Stomach aches, headaches, not wanting to go to school, not sleeping well, nightmares, you know, bruises, marks for physical abuse, self-talk that's negative all of a sudden, high peak emotional, I've got to be online at 10 o'clock, I've got to be online at 10 o'clock. You can't cut off the internet, right? What's behind those things? That's where we have to be curious. So that leads me to tips for talking to kids. Using a conversation starter, and we can provide some of those. Getting down on their level, giving them a fiddler, having them move. Magic for boys or any kind of kinetic child. Walking with them, putting them in the back seat of the car where they don't have to look right at you. Or being the driver when they're talking to their friends in the back seat. You're gonna get a lot of information from that. And then how are you gonna tease out more information? You're gonna use open-ended questions, right? Like, tell me more about that. I heard you say that, and I just wanna hear. Practice being that sounding board. If every time they come to you, you try to solve their problem, they're not going to come to you for the big stuff. Validate, don't relate. So hard. Oh my gosh, I just want to say, that happened to me. I did that. Just hear them. That must have been really hard. Keep your story for another time, right? Because then that makes it about you. Even if there's really good lessons there, don't, hold it. Use non-judgmental questions. We like to say, don't say why. Why is just really judgmental. So use those open-ended questions. And it's okay if a child tells you something, because if you're going to allow a child to speak to you, you need to be prepared to be changed by what you hear. And you may inside be screaming, and you may need to step back and compose yourself, or say, I don't really have a good answer for you right now on what, you know, this latest new term is that the kids are using or doing, but can I get back to you? And then get back to them. Because what we know from survivors is that the reaction and the bad emotional reactions that adults have is silencing and sometimes more traumatic than the harm in the first place. Watching your parent become undone, your dad fly into a rage to kill the soccer coach or what, this feels like the message we should be sending, but it's terrifying to a child who may have very different feelings about the offender or the perpetrator than you do. So control those emotions and highlight the strengths. I'm so glad you told me. It was so strong of you to talk to me, to persist and let me hear you, to be brave, to tell me. Thank you for telling me. So we are, all of us, building sanctuary in the safe environments that we create, the suitable activities we lead, and the healthy relationships we establish. Every time we work with a child and we are showing them what healthy relationships look like, on our bad days, maybe we're whining, maybe we're threatening, maybe we're bribing. We need to just be aware that we're showing them what healthy relationships don't look like, forgive ourselves, and move on, but have more on the plus side than the negative side. And we can think about what are we already doing in our community. I can tell you something already. That beautiful jigsaw puzzle you have out on the wall about building connections, that's a protective factor for kids. You're already doing it. Are there any other things you want to share with me that you're doing in your community to keep kids safe? Yes?
The two-person rule for any classroom activities or activities that involve children or youth.
Okay, so this is the rule of three, or the two adults, maybe, right? Visible, interruptible. I'd say that two adults don't automatically make kids safe, but for sure being visible and interruptible is something positive you can do. I'm so glad you're doing that. All of you are here. You're going to give this video to any interested community members or people who volunteer at the church. Those are all really important things that you're doing. Any others you want to share? No? Here is a list. Really just deciding as a community, I'm just going to pick out the blue ones, that all adults are responsible. And having those warm, authentic relationships with children, that's protective. So it's really important that those continue. This is a video that I absolutely love. You're welcome to grab the QR code now and watch it later. It's about parenting. It's great to watch with young people because it's young people talking to adults in their lives. It's just, you can also find it online by Googling Parenting, New York Times Magazine. And it's funny and it's lightweight. So if some of you have problematic friends or children, adult children who are maybe oversharing on social media, and you want to send the message that maybe we need to start talking to young people about that oversharing, this is a great way to do it because it's kind of lighthearted. I'm going to skip it right now because I think you've been here for hours this morning, and I want to focus on self-care for you. Please know that anyone who's a parent, anyone who's an important askable adult in a child's life, that them seeing you take care of yourself, them seeing that you make space to be healthy is a protective factor for children. It teaches them skills, it teaches them trust, it creates belonging and attachment, and it's really important. So I invite you at any point to be thinking all the time about what do you want to do more of, see more, and have more for the children in your lives. Think about what those things are and deliver them to the young people that whose lives you touch, because they're not just your grandchildren or your children. They're your neighbors. They're the friends of your children. They are in your Sunday school classrooms. They're in the supermarket. They're in your neighborhood. And all of those children are potentially children that you can help keep safe. So these slides will be available to you. You've got, actually in the bathrooms, I love on the back of the stall doors, some of these help numbers, and here they are again. And remember from the beginning, I mentioned that there would be a QR code for you to evaluate your sort of knowledge after this presentation, and I just invite you and thank you for doing that for us. And Susan, do you have anything else that you want to say to the group?
Mainly I just want to thank you all for coming. I know we've done different versions of this, and thank you, Laurie, for coming and doing this as an outside person. I think it's so valuable, and for sharing this so that we can have it for others who weren't able to be here. I guess just from an update from the church, Laurie and Gail and I have been working on updating our Safe Church policy. We're calling it our Safe Community policy. It will talk also about conflict resolution in the church more generally, and also touch on these policies. And we're working now to kind of finalize that and figure out, policies that really fit our church and our resources and our, circumstances here. So I think that should be done by end of year, hopefully sooner, but I'll under promise and over deliver. So I guess if you have thoughts, we have a few minutes here. I know if people want to have a discussion, but otherwise, myself, Laurie, and Gail Perry are all on the Safe Community Committee, and also available by email at safechurch@lrucc.org. So any follow-up thoughts or comments are welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I see you got a mic, so.
I don't have any.
No?
If anyone has it, then I'm like,
Okay. Or maybe we just sit with this. It was a lot of information. Thank you so much for your time and attention and for staying on. And please, this is information you want to share. Feel free to share the recording. Feel free to, reach out to us at SCAN, or just open a conversation. You may be very surprised by what you hear. Many survivors are not afraid to talk about this, and so our lives are filled with the knowledge of many other survivors. If you're a supporter, thank you. You're really important to the recovery of survivors. If you're not, understand that you may not know a lot of survivors because you maybe haven't asked the questions or heard them. So I just encourage you to be bold and brave and be willing to have conversations that are hard, because that is the best way to stop this from happening. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Can I ask one thing real quickly?
Sure.
Is it possible to get a printout of a couple of those screens? You had the thing on ACEs, and I am not familiar with that, and I know there were about 10 items up there, and I couldn't read them all.
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to share all of the slides, and please keep in mind that the so-called modern ACEs include many more aspects, and you can certainly put that into Google. What are the traditional ACEs, the 10 original ACEs, and then what are the modern ACEs, which include more, things like natural disasters. We have people traumatized in Florida right now, earthquakes and war and a lot of other things that aren't as preventable are also trauma-inducing in childhood. And I think the key here is that these are things that happen to you in childhood, so they change the way you engage with the world and your brain function. So, Craig.
So just to be super clear, this presentation will be up on the church's YouTube page probably before midnight tonight, depending on what the child has planned for me. What did she do? Anyway, if you want to see the slides, watch it, share it with folks who weren't here, it'll be at the Little River YouTube page, probably by midnight.
He gets it up because he may procrastinate working.
Craig, as skilled as you are, we kind of know who could get it up faster, but that's okay. But thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate being invited. Thank you.